The committee will come to order. Today, the committee will consider H.R. 4937, the Pipes Act of 2016, H.R. 4957, designating the Ariel Rios Federal Building, H.R. 4231, directing the Librarian of Congress to obtain a stained glass panel depicting the seal of the District of Columbia, and GSA Capital Investment and Leasing Program resolutions. I now recognize Mr. Denham for a motion.
Pursuant to Rule 1A1 of the Rules of the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure, I move that the chairman be authorized to declare recesses during today's markup.
Question is on the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. We will now consider H.R. 4937, the Protecting Our Infrastructure of Pipelines and Enhancing Safety Act of 2016. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Railroad Subcommittee and call up H.R. 4937, and that be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered. First, I want to commend Chairman Denham for all the work he has put into the bill. Pipelines, as we know, are critically important for getting energy products to markets and users, and I believe this bill will build on the pipeline safety advances we have been making. It was the Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials Subcommittee Chairman back in 2001 when I was the subcommittee chairman when we last authorized the PHMSA's Pipeline Safety Program. That bipartisan act included 42 specific directives for PHMSA to carry out to improve pipeline safety, half of which PHMSA has completed. PHMSA needs to finish out those provisions, and so I'm pleased that Chairman Denham's bill includes strong transparency and reporting requirements to keep the pressure on PHMSA to finish the 2011 work. Another major provision in this act is providing PHMSA with emergency order authority for pipelines. Most DOT modal administrations have EO authority, which will allow regulators to act quickly when they identify an industry-wide safety issue. That constitutes an imminent hazard to the future, to the public. However, other modes like FRA or the HAZMAT program have used EO authority very sparingly, and my expectation is Pipeline Safety Program will also use it rarely. As we've developed this language, we took great care to tailor it to the unique aspects of the pipeline system, which is an interconnected network that supplies vital energy products to homeowners and major businesses. So at the front end, we include language that requires PHMSA to consult with the industry stakeholders and other federal and state regulators prior to issuing an EO, so that PHMSA understands the potential impact on the economy, the end users, and safety. We also include extensive due process procedures on the back end so that the agency makes a wrong call, affected parties have redress both administratively and judicially. Specifically, we require PHMSA to issue regulations to carry out this authority, including requiring administrative law judge procedures that mirror similar requirements in the HAZMAT EO authority. I believe this is a good bill. It builds on the work we've accomplished in 2011 Act. I look forward to working with the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Senate on getting a new Pipeline Reauthorization Act this year. I want to thank Chairman Denham, Ranking Member Capuano, and Ranking Member DeFazio for their cooperation and leadership on this bill. And I now recognize Subcommittee Chairman Denham to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to also thank Mr. DeFazio, Mr. Capuano for working with us to get this bill done. This is the Protecting Our Infrastructure of Pipelines and Enhancing Safety Act of 2016. The Pipes Act of 2016 will help to make sure that the United States, which has the largest network of energy pipelines in the world, is also the safest in the world. Pipelines are a critical part of our energy framework, transporting 64% of the energy commodities within the country. In order to ensure that pipelines remain the most cost-effective and safest means to transport energy products, oversight of DOT's pipeline safety programs is imperative. Throughout this Congress, the subcommittees worked in a bipartisan manner to develop this legislation. We've held a number of hearings, roundtables, and listening sessions to hear from PHMSA, safety advocates, and other stakeholders on the need for authorization. First, we make sure PHMSA is focused on finishing out the 2011 provisions by requiring PHMSA to update Congress every 60 days on their progress. In the 2011 law, there were 42 congressional directives, of which only 26 are complete. This reauthorization improves safety in many ways, one of which is by setting minimum federal standards for underground natural gas storage facilities. The bill also authorizes emergency order authority for the pipeline sector, but with important language that ensures PHMSA will assess the potential economic, end user, and national security impacts before acting. Following our subcommittee's roundtable last year on technological developments, this legislation promotes better use of data and technology to improve safety. GAO is required to study the latest innovations in pipeline materials and corrosion prevention. Improving third-party damage prevention, a leading cause of releases, is also an important goal. This bill includes a study on developing new technology to improve this area. To ensure an information sharing system is used to improve safety outcomes, this bill creates a working group comprised of PHMSA, states, industry stakeholders, and safety groups to develop such a system in a balanced manner. Ultimately, our goal is to make sure we have the safest pipeline network possible. We've worked in a bipartisan manner with our Democrat counterparts to come to a mutual agreement on a bill that improves pipeline safety. I believe that this bill will succeed in improving the safety of our pipeline infrastructure. And again, I want to thank Chairman Schuster, Mr. DeFazio, and Mr. Capuano in working with us on an important piece of legislation.
I thank the gentleman and now recognize Mr. DeFazio for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just join the chorus here. This is a good work product. It is a bipartisan bill. I think it's superior to either the House Energy and Commerce bill or the Senate bill with a number of the provisions that we've included on a bipartisan basis. Emergency order authority for PHMSA is critical. You know, they have the authority for hazmat, but not for pipelines. Right now, they can only issue a corrective action order targeted toward a particular incident. And, you know, there's an example where a number of years ago, PHMSA identified defective pipeline from China, but it had no authority to require the industry on a widespread basis to address the defects. They can only issue voluntary guidance requesting the industry take action. I think there's two lessons there. Don't buy pipeline from China. And we are now going to be able to act when they send defective product here. You know, there's been some concern raised that this would be a backdoor way for rulemaking. The specific language we included in the bill would absolutely preclude that. You know, I'm confident this would be rarely used, but it would be used in the interests of public safety. In terms of the backlog at PHMSA, we have a relatively recent change in leadership, and I feel that the new leadership is taking that agency in a much better direction than it has embarked upon in the past. And the bill here is going to focus in on provisions of the last reauthorization that 5 years ago, and we've only got 2 NPRMs to show for it, a national notice of proposed rulemaking. You know, I'm just so tired of the bureaucratic process around rulemaking. It's just so laborious, and then of course, then when OMB gets involved, it's even worse. So, you know, we are going to have transparency on those issues and hopefully accomplish the goals that Congress set them on 5 years ago. It would be, we've had issues where in responding to major spills, particularly the Enbridge spill, that the first responders, emergency responders did not have proper knowledge of what that spill was. And now within 6 hours, they're going to have to provide MSDS sheets to tell people what they are dealing with. It does allow PHMSA to implement safety standards for underground natural gas storage. You know, most notably the problems in California. Oregon has 7 facilities, and the states will be allowed to exceed the federal baseline, but having a federal baseline, I think, is important. It does increase grants to states to help them carry out their intrastate duties. All in all, I think this is a good piece of work, and I highly recommend it to my colleagues.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Capuano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just want to, again, join the chorus, as my leader said. I'm getting a little tired of having a working committee this size that actually does something. I think we really need to join the rest of Congress and yell at each other and scream at each other and get nothing accomplished. And I know that that's not what people expect, but this is exactly the way it's supposed to work. We have a very good product here. Neither side is perfectly happy, but that's exactly the way democracy works. We're making America better with this bill. I'm looking forward to voting for it. I want to publicly thank both yourself, Mr. Schuster, and Mr. Denham on the other side. You have been, I don't want to get you in trouble, but I've actually enjoyed working with both of you, so I don't want, if you have to explain that to anybody, I guess that's too bad. I apologize. And of course, Mr. DeFazio on my side has always been a pleasure to work with and to know. I also want to take a minute to thank PHMSA. We've worked with them on this bill. For me, this is some new area. I'm not an expert on pipelines or hazardous material. They've been very helpful in educating me and enlightening me. And I will tell you that under the new leadership, they have become much more open and responsive. And I also want to thank the staff. As a former staff member myself, I tell you that they do most of the work. We kind of just take the accolades, and I particularly want to thank on our side Jennifer Esposito Homendi, who has been my guiding light and my kind of rock to rely on. And on the other side, Fred Miller. I know that neither one of you work alone, that we are surrounded by great staffs, but without your cooperation, we'd be at each other's throats. And it's so much easier when we get along. Differences beside, we get along, and when the staff can work professionally and cooperatively, and I think it's important to point that out. Mr. Chairman, it's been a pleasure. I'm looking forward to voting for now the second positive piece of legislation to come out of this committee this year, out of this subcommittee this year, and I look forward to moving it to the floor.
I thank the gentleman. If it would make you feel more at ease, I come from a big family, so I'll take you out back and we can yell and scream at each other. I just don't want to do it in public. That's what I'm used to doing at home with my brothers and sisters. So, and I figured you're from Boston, so you're used to mixing it up too.
We usually use weapons. That's
Baseball bat.
Thank you, Mr. Capuano. Any other members wish to be heard or have a statement? Ms. Miller from Michigan.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of comments on this bill, and which I'm going to be very happy to support, but and there's a couple of items that have been included in here at my behest, and I'm appreciative of that. I just want to speak a little bit about pipeline safety and what it means to my state and my region, quite frankly. And, you know, as a nation, we always think about our energy sources and other places that it comes from. Quite frankly, Canada is not only my state of Michigan's largest energy provider, they're the largest energy provider for the United States of America. And when you think about the mitten of Michigan, we have these pipelines coming from Canada that are transiting energy, which we want and which we need. But obviously, it needs to be done in a very safe manner. And in the state of Michigan right now, we have a lot of concern, both Democrats and Republicans. In fact, I was listening to our senior senator this morning on the radio, a Democrat, talking about this very issue. This is a really bipartisan area of concern, because when you think about the Great Lakes, it is literally over 20% of the freshwater drinking supply of the entire planet. Of course, there's more fresh water under the Arctics, but you can't get at it. And so, and there's all kinds of currents and the lake levels and winds. Because of all these things, you can imagine if we were to have any kind of exposure or spill or whatever, how catastrophic that could be. I mean, unbelievable. There's a pipeline called Line 5 that goes under the Straits of Mackinac between Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. It's transiting 540,000 barrels of crude oil and natural gas every day. And this was something that was constructed in 1953. There's a tremendous amount of consternation about its safety right now. The University of Michigan just in the last 2 weeks have put out a report that showed that if there was any kind of a leak, over 700 miles of the Great Lakes could be impacted. So I raise this as one because of the Great Lakes, and you know, we had the largest onshore oil spill in the United States history from the same company that has the Line 5. This is what they call Line 6B. That was back in 2010 in the Kalamazoo River in southwest Michigan. And at that time, this Line 6B also goes into my district from Canada under what they call the St. Clair River. I know you can't all see the mitten here, but running from Canada into Michigan. Again, we want the energy. Canadians are our greatest ally, our best friends. We want the energy, but it's got to be done safely. That particular Line 6B, they had showed with their televising with the pig and that there was an anomaly in the line. And so they reduced the amount of product that was transiting there by about half and said that would be their solution, which was not the correct answer, quite frankly. And this committee had a hearing on that. Long story short, they did the right thing. They actually built 3,600 foot of new pipeline. And of course, they just let the old one atrophy, but we all feel very good about that. The company responded, the industry responded. We want the energy, but it's got to be done in a safe way. Just within the last month, and this will be just one thing I'll say about this as well, again, in a bipartisan way, there was a public comment period that almost nobody knew about a couple of old lines that run again under the St. Clair River. Myself and Representative Debbie Dingell sent a letter to John Kerry, to the Department of State, saying, nobody knew about this public comment period. Could you extend the public comment period? Which they did for a month. And during that time, they got almost 700 comments from people that are concerned about these lines. So I just say, and I think the work that has been done in a bipartisan way on this piece of legislation is very important. I think it advantages us from an energy supply standpoint and a safety supply standpoint, but obviously a principal advocacy for anybody who comes from the Great Lakes region, and certainly Michigan, which is known as the Great Lakes state, is always about the Great Lakes. And so I raise that because there are two pieces of there's two parts in this bill which I supported and was delighted that it's in here. One, it actually designates the Great Lakes as a USA ecological resource, meaning that any pipelines in close proximity have to undergo additional integrity management procedures beyond the standard pipeline safety measures. Very good thing. And then lastly, Mr. Chairman, it also includes a provision requiring that emergency spill response plans include procedures for waterways and shorelines that contain ice coverage, which up in our neck of the woods, believe it or not, we get a lot of ice. And something could happen during the winter months. So I am very appreciative of Chairman Denham and Chairman Schuster on our side, and certainly on the Democratic side of working with us to get these two pieces of, two parts of this bill included on here in the Great Lakes. And I think that we need to do more, but this is a fantastic start, and I think it is a very appropriate one as well. And I thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. Any other members wish to be heard? Ms. Napolitano is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member DeFazio and Chairman Denham and Ranking Member Capuano for the bipartisan work on this PIPES Act. I particularly want to thank committee leadership for working with my colleague, Congressman Sherman, and with the state of California in Section 12 regarding underground natural gas storage facilities. Although I do share the concerns of my colleague Berman that this bill does not go far enough to protect residents, such as those in California who experienced a major natural gas leak earlier this year in Aliso Canyon. Over 100,000 metric tons of gas leaked into the atmosphere, which was the largest natural gas leak in U.S. history. Thousands of residents were evacuated for months, and the investigation into what went wrong. Section 12 of this bill requires the Secretary of Transportation to issue minimum safety standards for underground natural gas storage facilities. I'm grateful that Section 12 also includes a provision very important to me and to the state of California that allows states to go above and beyond federal regulations for regulating underground natural gas storage facilities. Section 12 also imposes a fee on operators of underground natural gas storage facilities to support the federal underground natural gas storage safety program. I do share the concerns with Rep. Sherman that the 2-year implementation period for creating natural gas storage standards is too long, and that the inclusion of considerations for costing consensus in these standards can be used as veiled way to protect the industry at the expense of public safety. Additionally, I appreciate that the bill gives Secretary of Transportation emergency order authority to address imminent hazards, but I remain concerned that this provision does not require PHMSA to act immediately to protect the residents of Porter Ranch and San Fernando Valley. Mr. Chairman, as Ranking Member of Water Resources Committee, I want to thank you for including Section 19 that requires pipeline operators to regularly inspect, make repairs, and prepare for pipeline spills in the areas where the pipelines cross navigable waters. We must protect our lakes, our rivers, our streams, as they provide for our residential and industrial water supply, as well as maintain our environment. Thank you very much again, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, we will now consider the bill for amendment. And with that, I recognize Chairman Denham for an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This manager's amendment improves the bill and is based on feedback we've received from stakeholders and members of this committee. We include several changes to the emergency order authority provision to tighten up the language and make our legislative intent very clear. It's important that we get this authority right, and so I want to thank Mr. Graves and Mr. Babin and our stakeholders for helping to improve this provision. We also include important provisions to improve the way PHMSA runs its research and development program, which is a top priority for Mr. Capuano. This language will ensure that PHMSA's R&D products are peer-reviewed and do not have conflict of interest, so we can be confident the data is used by PHMSA. Pipeline safety is a partnership between PHMSA and the states, and we include language from Mr. Barletta, Mr. Lipinski, and Ms. Esty that will look at how effective this partnership is in overseeing interstate pipelines. We also add language to the pipeline materials and corrosion prevention study in Section 21 to look at the adequacy of training in the industry as suggested by Ms. Esty. Finally, we include language from Mrs. Hahn that requires PHMSA to issue guidance to pipeline operators on how to classify the status of pipelines, which is based on the lessons learned from the incident in her district, which was in 2014. This is a good bill. This manager's amendment makes it even better, and I want to thank all of my colleagues for working with me on it.
Thank you, Mr. Denham. I agree with the gentleman that this does improve the bill. And with that, do any other members wish to be heard on it? Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I share in that assessment that this would improve the bill. It does have particular provisions, one from Ranking Member Capuano, which strengthens R&D and conflict of interest protocols at a request of a number of members. It requires the GAO to evaluate pipeline and hazardous materials safety agreements by PHMSA with states to conduct safety oversights of interstate pipelines, requires the Secretary of Transportation to provide written notification to a state that has denied the authority to conduct such oversight, as well as reasons of denial. At the request of Ms. Hahn, it requires the Secretary to issue guidance to owners and operators of pipeline facilities and states regarding actions taken to identify active or abandoned pipelines. And at the request of the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. Esty, it amends a study on pipeline materials and corrosion technologies to include evaluation of adequacy of training provided to personnel responsible for identifying and preventing corrosion in pipelines. All good things. With that, I recommend the manager's amendment to my colleagues.
Thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be heard? Mr. Capuano.
It's a good amendment. You should vote for it. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be heard on it? Ms. Hahn.
Thank you, Chairman Schuster, and thank you to my colleagues, Mr. Denham, Mr. DeFazio, Mr. Capuano, and the staff for working with me on this. Really appreciate that in the manager's amendment language, we have language that hopefully will prevent oil pipeline leaks like the one that greatly damaged my community of Wilmington. Wilmington in California sits on top of one of the largest oil fields in the nation and a complex system of pipelines. And because of this, that community is faced with a heightened threat of pipeline leaking or exploding. 2 years ago, as Mr. Denham knows, this became an unfortunate reality for many residents when a pipeline ruptured, causing thousands of gallons of crude oil to spill into residential neighborhoods and created havoc and health issues for families who live there. At the time of the rupture, there was confusion over what went wrong because of how the pipeline operator classified the pipeline. According to PHMSA, pipelines are only considered to be either active or abandoned. When a pipeline is labeled active, they require regular inspections. When they're labeled abandoned, they are emptied and plugged. However, Phillips 66 had classified this pipeline as idle, one of the many terms used by the industry in order to avoid the official process of labeling pipelines as abandoned, which caused it to fall into a regulatory loophole that allowed it to go uninspected. When Phillips bought the pipeline, they claimed they were told it was empty by the previous operator. Phillips told the state of California and PHMSA that it was empty. And in 15 years of ownership, this idle pipeline was never inspected. No one verified that the pipeline was empty, and in fact, the pipeline wasn't empty. It had a few thousand gallons of oil, which corroded the interior of the pipe over more than a decade. This was an overall system failure. Last April, the acting PHMSA administrator, Butters, testified before this committee that there are times where the understanding interpretation isn't what it needs to be between state and federal regulators on the classifications of pipelines. So my provision, and thank you for including it in the manager's amendment, would prevent further misunderstandings by requiring PHMSA to provide state regulators, pipeline operators, and owners clear definitions of what active and abandoned pipelines are and formal guidance as to how to change their status in order to comply with federal regulations. I still think it's important for inspections to occur and to be verified after every sale, and that's why 2 years ago I introduced a bill that would have required inspection and a third-party verification of all pipelines after a sale. And while my legislation didn't make it into this bill, I am hopeful that these clarifications will protect countless communities like Wilmington across the country. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady and appreciate her working with us. So her amendment does strengthen the bill, and thanks for her thoughtfulness and tenacity to make sure we put it in there. So thank you. Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none. Are there amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, I recognize Mr. Denham? No. Okay, we've already done that. If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Yeah. Are there any other amendments? Mr. Lipinski has an amendment at the desk.
I have an amendment at the desk. I ask unanimous consent that it be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 90, offered by Mr. Lipinski.
Mr. Lipinski is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you, Chairman Schuster, Chairman Denham, Ranking Member DeFazio, Ranking Member Capuano for this very important pipeline security bill. I don't think most Americans know how many pipelines that they have running through their community, so it's very critical that we do more to make sure that they are safe. Mr. Chairman, my amendment simply calls for a GAO study of federal oversight of pipeline cybersecurity standards. After September 11th, Congress gave the federal government the authority to issue regulations pertaining to the security of critical infrastructure. Instead of issuing regulations, the government deferred to the pipelines industry to develop and adopt voluntary standards. Now, we are continually reminded about the dangers of cyber threats, especially on critical infrastructure such as pipelines. Due to the nature of cyber threats, the technology used to defend against them is rapidly and continually evolving. Because the industry must be able to quickly adapt and respond to this changing environment, voluntary industry standards do make some sense. I want to commend the industry for working with the federal government to develop their standards. However, I remain concerned about the absence of an objective review of those standards and of the federal oversight of their implementation. This amendment would direct the GAO to conduct such a review, to examine existing standards, determine if they are adequate to defend against a potentially catastrophic attack on pipeline infrastructure, and report on the status of the industry's implementation of these standards. We know that the domestic natural gas industry has experienced major cyber attacks. And in 2008 in Turkey, we saw what can happen. A large explosion and ensuing fire of crude oil pipeline that was the result of the deliberate cyber attack that disabled alarms and caused the pipe to overpressurize before corrective action could be taken. But even in the absence of deliberate attack, something as simple as a flawed line of code could have consequences that impact public safety. So ensuring cybersecurity of pipelines clearly is something we need to be concerned about. But how can we verify that the whole industry is adopting best practices if there's no objective review of their efforts? And how do we know that these standards are adequate? Those are the questions I would like the GAO to help us answer. This does not put regulations, new regulations on the pipeline industry. It's simply looking to make sure that the pipeline industry's voluntary standards are adequate and are working. So I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment, but just to save a little bit of time here, I understand after discussions with the chairman and others that there are some questions here, issues about jurisdiction, although I always think we should fight for more jurisdiction, but concerns about jurisdictional issues on this issue because we're talking about cybersecurity. And so I'd be happy to withdraw this amendment if the chairman would work with me to make sure that something is done to take a look. I would really like to have a GAO study just to take a look to make sure that we are being safe in what we are doing. With that, I will yield back.
Well, I thank the gentleman for withdrawing. I certainly will be willing to work with the gentleman in consultation with the Ranking Member DeFazio to talk about and if they say we can't do to pushing this forward and making sure that that we are doing things safe when it comes to cybersecurity. So with that, Mr. DeFazio.
Well, I would concur with the chairman. I think that this may already be under consideration, given what we heard at a hearing last week about cybersecurity issues as relates to critical infrastructure. But this certainly, to be certain that this has been targeted, would be useful.
With that, gentleman withdraws. Hear the amendment.
I ask unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
Without objection, so ordered. With that, any other amendments? Mr. Sanford has an amendment. Mr. Sanford.
I thank Chairman. I think this is a very quick common sense amendment in that the last pipeline bill back in 2011 required the administration, or PHMSA rather, to conduct 42 rulemakings, of which 16 are still incomplete. 6 are in fact tied to yet completed, needed to be completed reports tied to rulemaking. And so we just looked at the overall package and said, are there efficiencies that could be found that would in fact save folks time so they could in fact focus on the things not yet complete? And in short, all this does is to move Section 3 from 60 to 90 days in terms of reporting. I don't think it makes a material change with regard to safety or other. It simply, again, moves that reporting period back from every 60 days, every 2 months, to every 90 days within Section 3. That's what the amendment does. I would encourage its adoption.
I thank the gentleman for working with us on this amendment. Changing the requirement from 60 to 90 days is something that we feel these reporting requirements would work. So happy to support the amendment.
I have no concerns with the amendment.
But with that, if without objection, we'll accept the amendment of the gentleman. Without objection. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Mr. Carson's recognized for an amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Schuster. I'm offering this amendment, sir, to provide better data about the health impacts of oil spills. I commend you, sir, and Ranking Member DeFazio, as well as Rail Chair Denham and Ranking Member Capuano on their hard work to bring together a very good compromise bill. This is one of the better committees in the Congress that works together in a bipartisan fashion, so thank you all for that. You know, I'm very pleased, Mr. Chairman, with the improved information to pipeline communities, especially providing the safety data sheets and grants for public awareness efforts, but I do believe we need more information. This amendment, Chairman, requires that the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most preeminent scientific organizations in the country, to study the short and long-term human health and ecological effects of pipeline oil spills. I'm raising this point because too often people confuse the effects of crude oil spills, such as BP's in the Gulf Coast, with other spills of diluted bitumen. Tar sands are more toxic, require more pressure for transport through pipes, and if spilled, will settle into riverbeds, contaminating the water supply for years. And we can't forget that Americans are still suffering from the effects of huge tar sands that occurred in 2010. And as a Hoosier, a representative of the Great Lakes region, I'm deeply concerned about risks to our rivers and streams from oil spills, both from pipelines or rail accidents. In closing, I'd like to say that as the ranking member of the Energy Management Subcommittee and a former first responder, I know how important it is to get this critical data as soon as possible, and we need this data before there's another spill. So, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, I thank the gentleman for offering the amendment. I understand his concerns when it comes to health and the environment. Though I must oppose this amendment, the main purpose of this bill is for pipeline safety and construction. In other words, keeping the product in the pipe. This amendment does focus, as I said, on long-term health and the ecology issues, which are topics really beyond this bill. I believe other committees are better equipped to deal with this, and I will note that in the last 5 years, there have been 13 different health studies that investigate the short and long-term effects of spills on human and the environment health. One of those studies is currently ongoing. So again, I understand what you're trying. I think it's better served in a different committee. So I would urge opposition at this point. Any other members wish to be heard? Mrs. Hahn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to speak in support of this amendment, especially since we have discussed what happened in my community of Wilmington several times in this committee. And while many studies have examined the effects of oil when spills occur in bodies of water, there are considerable fewer studies that have examined the impact of exposure to oil on land and in urban and suburban settings. I think my constituents deserve to know how oil spills could have affected their environment, their health. They could know what kind of conversations they should be having with their doctors. And I also think it does make sense that it helps with our commitment to the safety of pipelines if we begin to have data actually telling us how we should better keep our pipelines safe and better prepare our emergency responders in case of another accident. So I do think it's a good amendment. I do think it makes sense when we're talking about pipeline safety to actually understand why it's important that these pipelines are indeed safe. So I appreciate you bringing this amendment forward.
I thank the gentlelady. Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none. Are the amendments to the amendment? If no amendments to the amendment, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. Nay. The nays have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. We now move on to Amendment 72, Mr. Sanford. Mr. Sanford is recognized to explain his amendment.
I thank the chairman. This amendment may not be met with such gracious acceptance as the last one, but I think it's worth everybody's consideration. I would define it as a beautiful amendment in that it would save the taxpayers $24 million. And my question to each one of you as colleagues is if you can save the taxpayer $24 million without impacting safety, then why wouldn't we do so? And here, I guess, in brief, are my concerns or my thoughts on this one. One, if you look at pipeline spending, it has gone up 90% over the last 10 years. The actual mileage of pipelines has gone up at a much slower rate than the spending in the safety on the pipelines. In fact, if you look at the numbers, it's gone up by about 0.5% a year, actual mileage, while spending has gone up 5% a year. the two to me don't make sense. That you would want to correlate the increase in mileage of pipelines with the increase in spending on pipelines. Again, a tenfold increase in spending on pipeline safety over the actual number of new miles of pipeline. Secondly, I'd make the point of what a number of different charts that I have show here, which is actual pipeline incidents over the last 10 years, fatalities, serious incidents, has gone down or been flatlined. And my question is, if we had a tenfold increase in spending on safety, just to get a flat line in terms of result, is that what we'd really want in terms of taxpayer consideration? And then finally, I would say this. If you actually look at a chart, and I have one here, of funded versus actual spending with regard to the safety front, we've actually never filled all of the billets, if you will, on safety operators. In other words, so we have a tenfold increase in spending. We do not fund all of the authorized spending on that front in terms of safety, staffing, and so why would we want more if we're not even filling all the billets, so to speak, that are already out there? So 3 different bites at the apple. I think it's a common sense amendment. In this case, it would represent just a 3.5% cut of the proposed increase. It's not a gargantuan cut. It simply, again, allows us to hold the line a little bit more steady, allow $24 million to go back to users and to the taxpayer, while not jeopardizing safety. And in that regard, I think it's a beautiful amendment in Trump's words and a common sense amendment in our words.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Denham wishes to be recognized on this amendment.
I think you'd mean an amazing amendment in Trump's words.
Yeah.
Regardless, I share in your goal of reducing federal spending. We obviously want to reduce it anywhere we can, especially if money is not fully being utilized. But this bill follows the House of Representatives' cut-go rules, which state that we authorize at CBO's baseline levels. But in this bill, we actually go further than that. The bill freezes PHMSA's pipeline safety spending, and we take the inflationary increases in the CBO baseline and put them towards state grants. The challenge that we have here is that pipelines go across states in an interstate commerce issue. States can't go out and collect these fees. These fees are actually paid by the industry and utilized for a cleanup. They're put in a trust fund. They're used from everything from one call, that's the call that you make before you dig, as well as any big major spill. So having an emergency fund out there for a spill for a state, paid in by the industry, utilized in emergency capacity, but also in making sure that we have one call and others set up. Again, I understand the gentleman's goal. I have the same goal of wanting to cut federal spending anywhere we can, but this will not cut the federal outlays. Just cutting the user fees does not help the safety and integrity of what we're trying to accomplish here. Again, we go above and beyond our cut-go rules in freezing PHMSA's pipeline safety, but in the wanting to work with my good friend, I would be willing to work with you as we move forward to see if we can find a resolution that accomplishes our common goal.
I would hardly accept such a chance, and with that, I would defer on the amendment. I'd withdraw, and would look forward to working with you on this between now and the time of the drop on the floor.
I thank the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman from withdrawing.
Well,
Mr. Heroes?
I just wanted to add, some of these pipelines now are going through more populated areas, and we should be more concerned in terms of when we cut, especially on the safety budget part of it.
I appreciate the gentleman. Again, appreciate the gentleman withdrawing, and I appreciate his position as a deficit hawk. He's always concerned, as we all should be, about these deficits and debts that we keep building in this country, growing. With that, we go to Amendment 62. Ms. Hahn. Ms. Hahn? You're on.
Again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk, and I'm asking unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to my colleague, Congressman Larson, for joining me in offering this amendment. One of the most somber responsibilities this committee has is to hold hearings on devastating and often deadly accidents and that sometimes occur in the process of transporting goods, people, and the natural resources we all rely on. Although sad, they are necessary because they provide us with the insight we need in order to improve safety and provide justice for the victims. Last month, almost 6 years after the San Bruno, California explosion that took the lives of 8 people, Congresswoman Jackie Spear testified once more before this committee about her frustration with the federal government's inability to hold everyone directly involved with this tragedy accountable. In my own congressional district, it's unclear as to whether anyone can be held accountable for an oil spill that happened in the neighborhood of Wilmington. These incidents are not isolated to California. There have been thousands of pipeline incidents over the last 20 years. However, federal charges have only been brought 4 times since 1996. This is because in order for a pipeline operator to be prosecuted, they must be found to have acted knowingly and willfully. And according to the Inspector General of the Department of Transportation, this standard is a significant obstacle to bringing more successful prosecutions. Last month, he stated that the standard should be changed to include recklessly. The amendment Congresswoman Larson and I are offering today would take the Inspector General's recommendation and change the standard for a criminal liability for pipeline operators to include acting recklessly. For years, pipeline operators have not made safety a priority and have been able to sometimes walk away from destructive and deadly pipeline accidents by just paying administrative fines. Representative Spear, Larson, and I agree with the Inspector General. Fines have become nothing more than the cost of doing business for these companies. The possibility of criminal prosecution would make the safety of our communities a priority and allow the federal government to better enforce pipeline safety law. We already prosecute other types of reckless behavior in order to incentivize safety. In 1996, a Value jet airplane took the lives of 110 people when it exploded because of improperly stored cargo. No federal criminal charges could be filed because at the time, the standard for prosecution in the transportation of hazardous materials was also knowingly and willfully. The clear injustice of the situation resulted in the law being amended to include recklessly in 2005. My amendment would merely mirror this change in pipeline safety law. We shouldn't wait for another accident with mass casualties in order for us to act. I understand that accidents sometimes happen and for whatever reason cannot be prevented, and my amendment reflects this reality. Therefore, any companies making good faith efforts to comply with the law should not worry about facing criminal changes. I hope that I can count on everyone's support for this amendment. By doing so, we'd be implementing a recommendation by the DOT's very own Inspector General. We'd be mirroring what is already done for safety in the transportation of hazardous materials and provide our constituents with the peace of mind that we're looking out for them and we will work to bring them justice. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Unfortunately, I must oppose this amendment. The use of reckless as a standard in pipeline safety, I don't believe is needed. Reckless is subjective. It looks at behavior. What one person interprets as reckless, another may not. It's a particularly subjective standard for the pipeline industry, as operators' goal is 0 incidents, and understanding and managing that level of risk is their day-to-day work. PHMSA's safety program requires operators to make risk-based decisions and prioritize higher relative risk over lower risks. And I think criminalizing the awareness of risk facing pipelines could chill pipeline safety efforts on risk prioritization, reduction, and accident prevention. So again, I think that at this point, what we're doing is positive. Reckless, as I said, is very subjective, and so I would have to oppose the amendment. Any other members wish to be heard? Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your comments on this amendment. I do urge folks to support it. However, in his oral and written testimony before the committee in February, Carl Weimer from the Pipeline Safety Trust which is headquartered in my district, cited pipeline incidents in which the actions of a pipeline operator were so reckless that they would be considered criminal. He referenced the creation of the trust itself as having resulted from one of those instances where an operator's actions were so reckless that criminal penalties were warranted. Now, while the vast majority of pipelines are in fact operated safely, we've come a long way since the Bellingham explosions in 1999. We do need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to achieve the highest level of safety possible. This provision only holds person liable when their conduct is reckless, meaning they act with deliberate indifference or conscious disregard. And I would ask the committee to support this amendment, and with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. With that, Mrs. Napolitano is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the Hahn amendment regarding criminal penalty. I thank her for introducing this amendment in partnership with a colleague, Congresswoman Jackie Spear. Representative Spear introduced this provision as in a bill in the House, H.R. 4971, to streamline the criminal liability standard for pipeline incidents with the same standard that exists for hazardous materials incident. Rep. Spear's district, unfortunately, the location of a major pipeline explosion in San Bruno that claimed 8 lives, many injuries, and destroyed homes. For hazardous material incidents, Congress in Safety TLU, determined that the criminal liability exists if a person knowingly and willfully or recklessly violates the law. The standard was set to ensure that justice is served to persons who recklessly neglect safety. For pipeline incidents, the current criminal liability standard is much harder to prove because there is no consideration for reckless behavior. The Hahn amendments tightens the criminal liability standards for pipeline explosions and makes it the same as the standard that currently exists for hazardous material. The Hahn amendment simply adds, I repeat, it adds the criminal standard of reckless to the current standard of knowingly and willfully damaging or destroying pipelines. I thank the Congresswoman Hahn and my colleague, Congresswoman Spear, for the work on the issue, and I do request that we support this amendment. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady. Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none other amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, if not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. Nay. In opinion, the nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. All right, the next amendment we're moving on to is number 60. Mr. Nolan. Mr. Nolan is recognized to explain his amendment.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Without objection, order, the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 60, offered by Mr. Nolan.
Mr. Nolan is recognized to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment is really aimed at improving safety, reducing environmental damage, increasing American jobs in this country, and quite frankly, doing what we need to maintain a strong economy and national security here in our country. What my amendment does is it would require that virtually all energy pipelines built and federally permitted in the United States contain 100% American steel and iron ore that is mined and processed and reprocessed here in America. This amendment would be a big boost for iron ore mining throughout this country. In my district alone, there are some 2,000 Iron Rangers that are out of work, along with tens of thousands of steel workers all across our nation, because China and India and other cheater nations have been allowed to illegally dump millions of tons of tubular as well as other low-grade foreign government-subsidized non-market economy steel into our marketplace. With that in mind, my amendment requires the Secretary of Transportation and the Pipeline and Hazardous Safety Administration, which is responsible for pipeline construction approval, to improve minimum safety standards for steel pipe used in the United States. Those standards would mandate the use of steel produced in the United States that originates from ore and taconite mined and processed in the United States. Recycled steel would be permitted, provided it included supplemental concentrates made of iron ore and taconite produced here in the United States. as would limited waivers only to the extent that the U.S. capacity is not adequate to meet demand in any given year. The Pipeline Safety Administration has the regulatory authority to permit pipeline construction, but is severely hampered by its inability to inspect foreign steel pipeline manufacture operations or to independently verify engineering data to assure that all pipe laid in the U.S. borders is truly safe. As a matter of fact, they're limited to just a visual inspection, which is virtually useless. To help remedy that situation, my amendment authorizes up to $10 million annually for the agency to pull and independently test pipeline from stockpiles to be used in the United States rather than forced to simply accept manufacturers' safety documentation. Mr. Chairman, under the current law, they're limited to visual inspections. Obviously, we can't send inspectors into foreign manufacturing facilities to see what they're doing. And it's become apparent, over the last 20 years, there's been a gradual increase in pipeline accidents that have been cost hundreds of lives, caused irreparable environmental damage, and that corresponds with a dramatic increase in the importation of tubular goods from these other so-called cheater non-market economies. So, and in that regard, the International Trade Commission has found 161 cases of illegal dumping of non-market economy steel into this country, including tubular goods. I've spent some time in that business myself, and it's well recognized around the world that American tubular steel is clearly the best. If you talk to any iron workers or welders, they will tell you that it is best. And recently, Homeland Security made a determination that the U.S. steel industry is in danger of going out of business. And it would be very threatening. It would cause a Great Depression. It would, put 7 million people out of work. So this is about safety. This is about jobs. And it's something that we simply have to do. So, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time here for the moment. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman for offering his amendment. However, I must strongly oppose the amendment. This amendment would apply Buy American requirements to pipeline construction by the private sector with private sector funding. This would be unprecedented. We have never applied Buy American to infrastructure projects constructed without federal dollars. This would set a troubling precedent, and there is no federal nexus for the government to mandate the use of certain materials for private entities. So again, I would strongly oppose. And with that, recognize Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I obviously have fought for the strongest possible Buy America requirements in anything that moves through this committee that relates to federal spending, and we did increase the domestic content requirement for transit in the last FAST Act. And the gentleman makes excellent points. He's an incredible advocate, not only for his district, but for American workers. And the Chinese do have massive, just recently some articles about the massive overproduction and dumping of steel from China, much of it of substandard quality. Look at the Oakland Bay Bridge and the massive costs incurred there because of a plant built in China by an American who got the contract to make beams that had never been made before, which had to be redone when they got here because of crappy work by the Chinese, as cheap as their labor is. It ended up being more expensive than doing it here, and we lost the investment of building such a plant here. We've tightened that loophole in transit and highway spending also, but in this case, we did have an agreement among the ranking member, Mr. Capuano, myself, Chairman Schuster, and Chairman Denham, because we got some provision in this bill that were not avidly supported on the other side of the aisle, and we agreed that we would not accept any amendments that one side or the other of those four objected to. In this case, since the chairman objects, I would have to oppose the amendment.
Thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be heard?
Mr. Chairman, I think I got about 25 seconds left.
Mr. Nolan?
Mr. Chairman, we got to stop this window dressing business. Our Buy American Steel provisions are totally useless. Virtually all of the tubular goods coming into this country are foreign. Keystone, for example, 100% foreign steel. So if we're going to put something in here to Buy American Steel for the reasons I outlined, let's put some teeth into it and make it work and stop just giving the American people window dressing that's totally useless. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be recognized? Seeing none, other amendments to the amendments? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. Nay. The nays have it, and the amendment is not agreed.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman asks for a recorded vote. Yes, sufficient number of requested number of, where we go. Let's get to the bottom. The rules of the Committee of Transportation Infrastructure, agreeing with Mr. Fazio, we will hold the recorded vote until we have dispensed with all our debate on all the other amendments. It's Amendment 52. Mr. Maloney is recognized to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk and ask unanimous consent that it be considered read.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 52 offered by Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me start by thanking you, the ranking member and the subcommittee chair and ranking member for bringing up this important and bipartisan piece of legislation. I have an amendment to it that's frankly very simple, and that simply relates to a very real and growing issue in my part of the world, which is the basic issue of health and safety for the workers and the communities with pipeline infrastructure in their backyards. As you know, energy infrastructure is a terrific job creator, has potential to create lower energy costs, both in my state of New York and around the country, and actually to reduce our carbon footprint as we move to a more carbon-free economy. But of course, it's essential that we build this infrastructure in a way that puts safety and public health first. With the expansion of natural gas pipeline infrastructure, we've also seen an expansion in the number of pipeline compressor stations. In light of this expansion and in the number and size of these compressor stations, Congress has an obligation to ensure that it's being done in a manner that guarantees public safety and doesn't negatively impact both the workers and the surrounding communities where these stations are being operated. So my amendment simply asks that the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, conduct a study to examine the short-term and long-term health impacts specifically of these compressor stations on both the workers at these facilities and the surrounding communities. A GAO study will be a useful tool for Congress as we examine these issues and work to craft solutions regarding protecting the health and well-being of our constituents as we keep energy costs low. And we should, of course, reject the false choice between lower energy prices, better energy infrastructure, and public safety. They can go hand in hand. And so I absolutely believe that continued investment in our energy infrastructure is critical, but we owe it to the people who sent us here to ensure that it be done safely and with their well-being in mind. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for offering the amendment. However, I must oppose the amendment. The Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, has already been out there. They've occupied this field and will be finalizing a methane limits for new compressor stations this summer. The agency has announced that it will be issuing a mandatory data collection request for emissions for all existing facilities throughout the entire oil and gas segment, including compressor stations. So I do not believe that any additional studies at this point would do anything to help that effort. I think it's already being tended to. So with that, I would, again, oppose the amendment. Mr. DeFazio?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand the gentleman from New York's concerns, and this is a real problem for people very remote from from gas fields. And, I believe that his concerns are very legitimate. However, as I said during the previous amendment, I'm bound by an agreement among the ranking members and the two chairs and must oppose the amendment.
Thank you, gentlemen. Any other members wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. Nay. The nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Thank you, gentlemen. Number 62, Mr. Nolan has an amendment. Do you have an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, my amendment is at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 62, offered by Mr. Nolan.
Mr. Nolan is recognized to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my amendment would amend the Pipeline Hazardous Safety Materials Administration pipeline inventory safety standards to strengthen record keeping and reporting on steel used in pipeline facilities, and for the first time, the country of origin of the steel. In short, this amendment directs the Secretary of Transportation to identify a number of indicators in the agency's existing pipe inventory standards to better inform the public, such as the total steel by volume used to construct, replace, maintain the pipeline facility, the total amount of steel by volume identified that was produced outside the United States, together with a separate estimate of that volume for each country of origin of the steel, the total amount of steel by volume that originated from domestic sources, together with an identification of whether that steel was produced, processed, or fabricated in the United States, and for steel produced outside of the United States, an identification of the origin of the semi-finished steel processed and fabricated in the United States. The Secretary of Transportation is also directed to prepare and make publicly available online an analysis report that includes this information. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I was surprised to find that these existing requirements did not already exist. The Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration already has a number of analytics online. For example, we can find out that in Minnesota, steel makes up roughly a quarter of the material used in mainline pipes. But information is much harder to come by on where that pipeline originates. This amendment would help provide this information to this committee and policymakers by requiring a report to the Congress, as well as the creation of a database to better inform the public. I urge the adoption of my amendment and reserve the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for offering this amendment. However, once again, I must strongly oppose the amendment. This amendment sets a new precedent for requiring reporting on the origin of steel used in a safety-related program, not loan or grant program. While imposing Buy American-related provisions on the federal funding is common, the funds here are solely private in nature. I don't believe it's advisable that companies have to report on the origin of their pipes simply because they are regulated by the federal government. Once again, I think this is a slippery slope and that I cannot support. So with that, any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, are there amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. Nay. The nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on this I ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman has asked for a recorded vote. According to the agreement between Ranking Member DeFazio and I, we postpone to the end of the debate on amendments. With that, Amendment 53, Mr. Maloney is recognized to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk. I ask unanimous consent that it be considered as read.
Objection, clerk will designate.
Amendment number 53, offered by Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I have another very simple amendment to this legislation that touches on an extremely important issue that every member of this body should take seriously. The amendment would require GAO to examine methane emissions related to natural gas pipeline infrastructure and their overall impacts on the commitments the United States has made internationally to reduce our overall greenhouse gas emissions. I recognize that this is an issue that the EPA is currently examining, but I also know that it's an issue that must involve all aspects of our government if we are truly to understand and combat global climate change. I know some of my colleagues may be skeptical about this issue, but as we've seen, the effects of global climate change do not impact only Democratic districts or Republican districts, but it impacts all of our constituents. And my amendment would simply allow us to understand better the role that methane emissions play in the growing problem of climate change. So whether it's the crippling impacts of Superstorm Sandy in New York and New Jersey, or the devastating floods we've seen more recently in Texas, we want to understand what's going on with our climate, and we want to understand the role that methane emissions are playing, particularly because there are mitigations we can employ to capture methane or reduce methane emissions if it is determined to be as damaging to our overall climate change goals as some believe. So my amendment simply allows us to understand the scope of the problem and therefore, as Congress, be better positioned to address it. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for offering the amendment. Again, I must oppose this amendment, and I can assure you that I take it very, very seriously. The methane gas in my district in Pennsylvania, with the Marcellus gas play and the increased construction of pipelines throughout Pennsylvania, as I said, we take it very, very seriously. Although such projects are already reviewed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, and must later then undergo a National Environmental Policy Act, a NEPA analysis, which will determine the environmental impact of those proposed projects. These NEPA determinations are case-by-case and fact-specific, and I do not believe this is the appropriate forum for this amendment. Again, I would oppose this amendment and recognize any other members wish to be heard. Seeing none, are there amendments to the amendments? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. Nay. Nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Next, number 22, Mr. Woodall, the gentleman from Georgia, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 22, offered by Mr. Woodall.
Mr. Woodall is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is going after both substance and process, but it's the process that this committee has the best opportunity to work on. I've never served on an authorizing committee before. I've been a budget committee member, a rules committee member, and what I love about this committee is the way that we are able to get things done together. What this amendment goes after is the placarding issue on trucks transporting fuels. Through a guidance letter, we have changed the regulatory rubric in a way that truckers are not only going to be at risk and at conflict with DOT regulations and OSHA regulations, but are going to be out of pocket over $80 million based on a guidance letter. The underlying legislation that we seek to amend, Mr. Chairman, as you know, requires a formal rulemaking process on this very issue. A petition was submitted more than 6 months ago, and the formal rulemaking process has not yet begun. It is unconscionable that we would allow guidance letters to impact folks in this way when we serve on a committee that is so cooperative and works so well together. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your efforts in this area. This amendment that I offer looks very similar to a unanimous amendment agreed to by unanimous consent by our friends over in the United States Senate. It seeks only to return to the pre-guidance letter standards that have been in place since 2000. And no one is suggesting have led to any issues. The underlying substance, Mr. Chairman, as you know, is the added alcohol with gasoline. Our firefighters use different techniques to fight an alcohol fire than they would a gasoline fire. And as we start having these conversations about E15, E85, we're talking about different firefighting techniques that are going to be required. But what we have done for the past 15 years is to allow truckers who are transporting E10 and below to placard to the lowest flash point of their fuel, so that any firefighter who has to encounter a tragedy knows what that lowest flash point is. What the guidance letter suggested is that, no, you have to put multiple placards on, and not only that, you have to change them manually yourself, again, in contravention of some DOT and OSHA guidance. The terminals won't allow you to do that in the facility, and no one is suggesting that there's a firefighting problem with E10 and below. We're only talking about E10 and above. More than $80 million out of pocket, Mr. Chairman, based on a guidance letter that affects a committee that has a history of working together to solve problems one by one. We don't need guidance letters to be in our jurisdiction. We're able to push that forward, as is evidenced by the underlying legislation that requires the formal rulemaking process to begin. What I would ask of my colleagues, Mr. Chairman, is not to require our truckers to put their safety at risk and go $80 million out of pocket on a provision that may well be rescinded when the formal rulemaking process begins. Now, when it's with no great pride, Mr. Chairman, that I use language that the Senate passed by unanimous consent. That's not generally the standard I use for success. I recognize that there are some issues that that need to be dealt with here, and I'd hoped we were going to be able to find some compromise language that would address those issues in an even tighter way than what the Senate has done. But when we failed in those efforts, Mr. Chairman, I now rely on what the Senate has done by unanimous consent. But I have been told this morning, much to my chagrin, that we were not able to get the Big Four agreement on that issue. I didn't work my colleagues on this issue because I had hoped we were going to be able to get it in the underlying agreement, and I don't want to put my colleagues on record in favor of guidance letters or against their truckers when we've not had a chance to work it all one by one, Mr. Chairman. So I intend to withdraw this amendment. But I say to you with the utmost sincerity and urgency, this is the committee that's moving things across the finish line. We're able to react in ways that other committees cannot. And I hope, again, based on this underlying legislation that requires the rulemaking process to begin, we will not let our truckers continue to be fined and disadvantaged based on this guidance letter. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my amendment.
I appreciate the gentleman, and I'm committed to continue to work with you. I share your concerns with it. I also really appreciate you withdrawing anything that the Senate has done. Although the reports in one of the journals yesterday was that the Senate's acting faster than the House, I'm happy to say that the bills that we have passed are House bills more than they are Senate bills. So slow and steady sometimes wins the race. So again, I appreciate Mr. Woodall's thoughtfulness. I appreciate him withdrawing the amendment, and we will continue to work on this issue. Thank you.
Ready to vote?
We are going to vote on the two amendments. First will be Nolan number 60, and the second will be 62. Yeah, with that, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Schuster?
No.
Mr. Schuster votes no. Mr. DeFazio? Mr. DeFazio votes no. Mr. Young? Ms. Norton? Ms. Norton votes yes. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Nadler? Mr. Micah? Mr. Micah votes no. Ms. Brown? Mr. Lobiondo? Mr. Lobiondo votes no. Ms. Johnson? Mr. Graves of Missouri? Mr. Graves votes no. Mr. Cummings? Mrs. Miller? Mrs. Miller votes no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson votes yes. Mr. Hunter? Mr. Capuano? Mr. Capuano votes no. Sorry. Mr. Crawford? Mr. Crawford votes no. Mrs. Napolitano? Mr. Barletta? Mr. Barletta votes no. Mr. Lipinski? Mr. Lipinski votes yes. Mr. Farenthold, Mr. Cohen, Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Gibbs votes yes. Mr. Series. Mr. Series votes yes. Mr. Hanna. Mr. Hanna votes no. Miss Edwards. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes yes. Mr. Denham. Mr. Denham votes no. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes yes. Mr. Ribble. Mr. Ribble votes no. Ms. Hahn.
No.
Ms. Hahn votes no. Mr. Massey.
No.
Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Nolan.
Yes.
Mr. Nolan votes yes. Mr. Meadows. Mrs. Kirkpatrick.
Aye.
Mrs. Kirkpatrick votes aye. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes no. Ms. Titus. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis votes no. Mr. Maloney.
Yes.
Mr. Maloney votes yes. Mr. Sanford. Mr. Sanford votes no. Miss Esty.
Aye.
Miss Esty votes aye. Mr. Woodle. Mr. Woodle votes no. Miss Frankel. Mr. Rokita. Mr. Rokita votes no. Mrs. Bustos. Mrs. Bustos votes aye. Mr. Katko. Mr. Katko votes no. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Babin. Ms. Brownlee. Mr. Hardy. Mr. Hardy votes no. Mr. Costello.
No.
Mr. Costello votes no. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Graves votes no. Mrs. Walters. Mrs. Walters votes no. Mrs. Comstock. Mrs. Comstock votes no. Mr. Corbello.
No.
Mr. Corbello votes no. Mr. Rouser.
No.
Mr. Rouser votes no. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin votes no. Mr. Bost.
No.
Mr. Bost votes no. Mr. Cummings?
Yes.
Mr. Cummings votes yes.
Do any other members wish to be recorded? Mr. Hunter?
Mr. Hunter is not recorded. Mr. Hunter votes no.
Ms. Titus, how is she recorded?
How am I recorded, please?
You are not recorded, ma'am.
I vote yes.
Ms. Titus votes yes.
Any other members wish to be recorded? Any other members wish to change their vote? Mr. Babin, how is Mr. Babin recorded?
Mr. Babin is not recorded.
Babin.
Mr. Babin votes no.
Mr. Huffman, how's Mr. Huffman recorded? Did you get
Mr. Huffman?
Mr. Huffman?
Mr. Huffman votes yes.
Ms. Napolitano, how's she recorded?
Ms. Napolitano votes yes.
Any other members wish to be recorded? The clerk will report the vote.
On this vote, the nays are 32, the yeas are 16.
The amendment is rejected. Now, Amendment 6, Mr. Nolan's amendment number 62. The clerk will record the vote. Call the roll.
Mr. Schuster?
No.
Mr. Schuster votes no. Mr. DeFazio? Mr. DeFazio votes no. Mr. Young? Ms. Norton? Ms. Norton votes yes. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Nadler? Mr. Micah? Mr. Micah votes no. Ms. Brown? Mr. Lobiondo? Mr. Lobiondo votes no. Ms. Johnson? Mr. Graves of Missouri? Mr. Graves votes no. Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings votes yes. Mrs. Miller? Mrs. Miller votes no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson votes yes. Mr. Hunter? Mr. Hunter votes no. Mr. Capuano? Mr. Capuano votes no. Mr. Crawford? Mr. Crawford votes no. Mrs. Napolitano? Yes. Mrs. Napolitano votes yes. Mr. Barletta? Mr. Barletta votes no. Mr. Lipinski? Mr. Lipinski votes aye. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mr. Sears? Mr. Sears votes yes. Mr. Hanna? Mr. Hanna votes no. Miss Edwards? Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes no. Mr. Garamendi? Mr. Garamendi votes yes. Mr. Denham? Mr. Denham votes no. Mr. Carson? Mr. Carson votes yes. Mr. Ribble? Mr. Ribble votes no. Miss Hahn? Miss Hahn votes yes. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Nolan?
Yes.
Mr. Nolan votes yes. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes no. Mrs. Kirkpatrick?
Aye.
Mrs. Kirkpatrick votes aye. Mr. Perry? No. Mr. Perry votes no. Miss Titus?
Aye.
Miss Titus votes aye. Mr. Davis? No. Mr. Davis votes no. Mr. Maloney?
Aye.
Mr. Maloney votes aye. Mr. Sanford? Mr. Sanford votes no. Mrs. Esty?
Aye.
Mrs. Esty votes aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall votes no. Ms. Frankel? Mr. Rokita? Mr. Rokita votes no. Mrs. Bustos?
Aye.
Mrs. Bustos votes aye. Mr. Katko? Mr. Katko votes no. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. Babin? Mr. Babin votes no. Ms. Brownlee? Mr. Hardy? Mr. Hardy votes no. Mr. Costello?
No.
Mr. Costello votes no. Mr. Graves of Louisiana? No. Mr. Graves votes no. Ms. Walters? No. Ms. Walters votes no. Mrs. Comstock? Mrs. Comstock votes no. Mr. Curbelo?
No.
Mr. Curbelo votes no. Mr. Rouser?
No.
Mr. Rouser votes no. Mr. Zeldin?
No.
Mr. Zeldin votes no. Mr. Bost?
No.
Mr. Bost votes no.
Do any other members wish to be recorded?
Mr. Chairman?
Ms.
Hi,
Ms.
Madam.
Brown? Has Ms. Brown recorded?
Ms. Brown is not recorded.
Ms. Brown votes yes.
Ms. Brown votes yes.
Any other members who we point to? Oh, Mr. Duncan. How's Mr. Duncan recorded?
Mr. Duncan is not recorded. Mr. Duncan votes no.
Any other members wish to be recorded? Seeing none, the clerk will report the vote.
On this vote, the nays are 34, the yeas are 17.
The amendment is rejected. With that, I recognize Mr. Denham for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that H.R. 4937 as amended be approved and reported favorably to the House.
Question on the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The bill is amended and is approved in order reported favorably to the House. We will next consider H.R. 4957 to designate the federal building located at 99 New York Avenue Northeast in the District of Columbia as the Ariel Rios Federal Building. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Economic Development Subcommittee and call up H.R. 4957, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered. I now turn to Subcommittee Chairman Barletta to explain the amendment.
H.R.
Please
H.R.
remove your-
4957 would
Suspend.
designate,
Gentlemen, suspend. Please remove your conversations from the committee room. We're still trying to conduct business. Mr. Barletta, proceed.
H.R. 4957 would designate the ATF headquarters building in the District of Columbia as the Ariel Rios Federal Building. I want to thank Ranking Member of the Subcommittee, Mr. Carson, for introducing this bill, and I am pleased to be a co-sponsor. ATF Special Agent Ariel Rios was shot and killed in Miami, Florida, working undercover as part of the then Vice President George H.W. Bush's South Florida Task Force in 1982. I believe it is more than fitting and overdue to name the ATF headquarters building after him. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Carson is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm very pleased to see that my bill is being considered by the committee this morning. I appreciate that subcommittee chair and mayor, former Mayor Barletta, and several other members of our committee who agreed to be original co-sponsors of this bill. As mentioned, the bill would name the current headquarters of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms after Special Agent Ariel Rios. Agent Rios was killed in 1982 while working undercover, trying to unravel a drug ring in Miami, Florida. As a former police officer who has also worked undercover, I appreciate how officers put their lives on the lines, agents as well. When they walk out of the door, leaving their families for the day, they're putting their lives at risk in a very fundamental way. In 1985, Congress saw fit to honor the ultimate sacrifice that Special Agent Rios had made. Congress had acknowledged the fact that he was the first ATF agent to die in the line of duty by naming the headquarters of the ATF building the Ariel Rios Memorial Building. His name stood for nearly 30 years until the building was renamed for President Clinton in 2012 to reflect the fact that it now houses the EPA. I think it's fitting that we're considering this bill 21 years after the Oklahoma City bombing, which occurred on April 19th, 2016. That tragedy forced Congress to reassess the security of federal buildings, and a new and more secure ATF headquarters building was now authorized and constructed. Unfortunately, the Rios name was not transferred to the new ATF headquarters. So this bill seeks to correct this omission and name the new ATF headquarters as the Ariel Rios Federal Building. You know, we often grant former federal judges, past presidents, and other high-ranking officials the honor of having their names grace federal buildings to recognize their public service. However, I believe it's just as important to honor everyday citizens like Special Agent Rios, who at great risk worked in public service to protect citizens of this great nation. In closing, I'm very pleased that so many members of our committee from both sides of the aisle have agreed to co-sponsor this legislation, including the legendary Madam Norton, Ms. Brown, Ms. Napolitano, Ms. Edwards, Ms. Comstock, Mr. Carbello. So I'm honored that Mr. Rogers, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, supports this bill. Former President H.W. Bush has written Congress in support of naming this building after Agent Rios, as well as several former directors of the ATF. One of those former directors, Mr. Brad Buckles, is here with us today. Thank you, Director. He's walked these hallowed halls for 2 years to restore the Rios name to the headquarters building, and I'm deeply honored and proud that this legislation is being considered today. Mr. Chairman, I thank you and Chairman Barletta, as well as the ranking member, DeFazio, for your support. And I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan bill by honoring Special Agent Rios. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, I recognize Mr. Barletta for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 4957 be approved and reported favorably to the House.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. Motion is agreed to. The bill is approved and reported favorably to the House. We will next consider H.R. 4231 to direct the Librarian of Congress to obtain a stained glass panel depicting the seal of the District of Columbia and install the panel among the stained glass panels depicting the seals of states which overlook the main reading room of the Library of Congress, Thomas Jefferson Building. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Economic Development Subcommittee and call up H.R. 4231, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I now will recognize Chairman Barletta to explain the bill.
H.R. 4231 is intended to include the official D.C. symbol, among others, at the Library of Congress. I want to thank Ms. Norton for working on an amendment to clarify that the inclusion of the seal would occur concurrently with a planned renovation to minimize any cost. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize Mr. Carson for a statement.
I concur, Mr. Chairman. I support this common sense amendment that makes clear that the addition of this glass panel should take place concurrently with the renovation of the Thomas Jefferson Building. I urge my colleagues to adopt this amendment. And if I may, Chairman, to yield my time, the remainder of my time, to Madam Norton.
Without objection.
I simply want to thank my two friends, the chairman and the ranking member, for including this, for their support of this bill. The fact that there is the seal of the District of Columbia in the members' reading room indicates it's probably an oversight, since all the states and territories at the time were included with a stained glass panel. And I very much appreciate your moving this bill forward. And I will have an amendment to make clear that this will take place only with the general restoration of the Library of Congress.
Any other members wish to be heard? I believe we will now consider for an amendment. Ms. Norton?
Just a point of clarification.
Before, yeah, Mr. Sanford?
I thank the gentleman, and I thank Ms. Norton for her, ceaseless advocacy for the District of Columbia and its people. I just, a point of clarification, though, is it is as a part of the general restoration, and there is no material additional cost in doing so, just to keep my deficit hat on. I'm correct in understanding that?
Her amendment does that,
Yeah.
what you just said. It doesn't do it now, but she's going to
Okay, gotcha.
perfect it. So, Ms. Norton, recognized for your amendment.
Well, the gentleman has expostulated on my amendment very well. This will take place when they're restoring the Library of Congress. I'm sorry, I didn't think to include this in the original bill, and I ask that this amendment be made a part of the original bill.
Wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, are there amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? If not, Mr. Barletta is recognized for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 4231 as amended be approved and reported favorably to the House.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. Motion is agreed to. The bill is amended. It is approved and ordered, reported favorably to the House. Lastly, we will consider two General Service Administration capital investment and leasing program resolutions. I ask unanimous consent to call up the resolutions in block, and that we be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize Chairman Barletta to explain the...
Today, we're considering two GSA resolutions for alteration projects. One of these projects addresses serious life safety issues that must be addressed before the federal tenants can safely return to the building. Each day, the health and safety issues are not addressed is costing the taxpayer. The other project will allow for vacant space to be backfilled and consolidate offices currently in leased space into owned space. I'd like to thank the subcommittee ranking chairman, Mr. Carson, for working with us on these resolutions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. I now recognize Mr. Carson for a statement.
Thank you, Chairman. And very quickly, I'd like to recognize and thank Chairman Barletta and former mayor with distinction. These projects, Chairman, as you know, have been fully appropriated, and after today's actions will be fully authorized. These actions will allow GSA to move agencies out of leased space back into federally owned space while upgrading security and ensuring the structural integrity of both federal buildings. These investments, Mr. Chairman, in our nation's infrastructure are critically important and well-placed. I urge my colleagues to support the approval of these two resolutions, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, we will now consider the resolution for amendment. No amendments. Mr. Barletta is recognized for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the two committee resolutions be approved en bloc.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The resolution is approved. I ask unanimous consent that each bill ordered reported today be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporating any amendments adopted. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make all necessary technical, clarifying, and conforming changes to each of the bills ordered reported today and each committee resolution adopted today to reflect the actions of the committee. Without objection, so order. Ask unanimous consent that the chairman, after consultation with the ranking member, has authority to strike or revise any provision of the bill ordered reported today that would cause a sequential referral to another committee or that would cause the bills to be subject to a Budget Act or Rule 21 Cutco point of order. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the committee authorize the chairman or his designee to authorize such motions may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on H.R. 4957 as amended, H.R. 4937, and H.R. 4231 as amended. Reported by the committee today or similar Senate bills. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to Rule 5 of the Rules of the Committee of Transportation and Infrastructure, the chair notes the presence of a quorum for actions taken on all committee business today. With that, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure has completed its business for the day, and the committee stands adjourned.